Hi folks, welcome to ADSR. I'm Stephen Ellestad. Make sure you subscribe to the ADSR YouTube channel and follow on social media for great production content. In this tutorial, I wanted to talk a little bit about developing your own personal mix workflow, because mixing is very much a different process for everybody. Now, we all have to do similar things and we have to have a good quality end result, but ultimately we want to be able to finish mixes in a reasonable time frame, and the key to that is really learning how to work efficiently and creatively, basically working smarter and not harder. And that really starts with having a fundamental process that works for you and your particular music. And I like to start figuring this out by thinking about the way you work. What are you doing right? What do you do really well? And what could you stand to improve? When you're trying to develop skills, you want to focus on those improvements. When you're trying to build efficiency and some good workflows, you want to find ways to correct the errors that are absolutely stopping you, but mostly focus on things that play to your strengths and minimize your weaknesses. And so knowing these strengths and weaknesses as a producer can really help you design a production workflow that plays to those. And so, to my mind, what are the goals of a basic mix? First of all, it needs to be a process that you can follow quickly and intuitively so that you can focus effectively on the creative aspects of mixing. And so it needs to have things like effective signal routing and metering, and hopefully those are set up ahead of time. And then a good mix is going to have a well-balanced frequency response. Little to no frequency masking, and that's when you have multiple elements with energy in the same frequency levels, and the stronger levels will mask the elements that are of a lesser gain level. A really good example of that is if you're watching television, for example, and you have a fan on. It can be very, very hard to hear the voices. And that's because the fan signal is stronger and it's masking things in that frequency range. If you turn that fan off, the voices are right there and very clear to hear. We also want to have in a basic mix an effective placement of elements with panning and depth, using things like our stereo field and time-based effects to place things front and back in the field. But ultimately, the basic mix is to give you a good starting point for further critical listening before you tackle advanced mix steps like automation. I really like to break my mixes down into a couple of different stages. The first one is a basic static mix. And so today I want to talk about how do you come up with your own workflows for this, and in the next video I'll break down an example process that you can follow. And so the real key is finding a workflow that works for you. And there's, like I said, many ways to mix a track, and no specific one way is correct. There's plenty of ways to be wrong, so don't misunderstand me. But whatever works for you and still gets you good results and achieves the technical goals that the mix needs, then that'll work just fine. And your workflow has to free you up to let you focus on the creative aspects of mixing. So one thing I like to do, especially with my students, is I have them write down a list of steps that will help them kind of prioritize and sequence out the mix process. And this isn't like a definitive checklist, it's just the things that you want to do before you do other things to kind of set yourself up to keep moving forward, making creative mix decisions efficiently. And so coming along with that is we need to be looking for ways to save time using things like presets and templates and channel strip settings. Basically, if you found something that works, or if you use something often, save yourself a step. Build a preset or a template session or something like that. Another thing that we'll find real efficient is to work on the mix in stages to give your ears a rest and keep the project fresh. There comes a point where you start to develop ear fatigue, and I find that short bursts of intense mixing, especially for students that are just getting started, can really go a long way to maximizing their efficient use of time on the mix. Going along with that, you want to make sure you're bouncing and printing your mixes in progress often and checking your work on other systems, like in the car, on headphones, on different sets of speakers, and in different acoustic environments. My personal mix process generally involves 3 or 4 different bounces as I go along so that I can kind of reorient myself with what needs to happen, make decisions about the next level of moves I'm going to make. And I find this also really gives a nice resting point for your ears. I'll often do a couple of bounces just in a single day, and then I'll just literally export it out to my Dropbox or something, and I'll go sit in my car, I'll check things out, I'll check it out in the stereo system outside in the hangout room. But generally, getting away from the DAW, getting away from that mix window will really help you kind of focus on things when you're just listening to them from an audio perspective. You're not looking at multi-tracks, you're not looking at faders. You can check your progress a little more effectively. And of course, save early and save often. Most of the modern DAWs are pretty good about saving your work even if the system crashes, but don't rely on that. Make sure you're saving. I, in fact, like to, as I move through different stages of mix, do a save as, and I save it under a different name. Static mix, first automation pass, final tweaks. And that way I have another point to go back to fresh if I need to for some reason. And so as we come up and start thinking about how we're going to approach our mix process and develop a personal process, one last thing I want to talk about in this video is the whole concept of additive versus subtractive mixing. Additive mixing starts with like one track, usually like a key element such as the vocal or the kick. What's most important in the track. It really depends on the style. Getting that dialed in and then bringing in other parts one step at a time. Basically adding things to that and making sure that at all times those critical elements have absolute priority in the mix. Your vocal is always front and center, or that kick is always front and center. On the other hand, subtractive mixing is going to start with all the faders up, whether it's in a whole mix or I like to do it in groups, and it brings the levels down to shape the mix. Especially when you're dealing with groups, say a full drum kit or a bunch of layers of synths, it can be a really effective way of just balancing elements inside of a group because you're kind of from the get-go listening to all the parts together and pulling things out. So both of these techniques can be very effective, and the real trick is to kind of learn what works for you and which one to use at a given point in the process. So that's just a basic overview, some things to think about as you approach your mix. In my next video, I'll actually break down an example process and walk you through how you could approach that to create a static mix that's ready for further development in automation, etc. All right, thanks a lot. I'm Stephen Ellestad. Again, make sure you subscribe to the ADSR YouTube channel. Have a great day.